The notification comes at 6:47 inches the morning, before my alarm, before my coffee, before I've had a single second to prepare myself for whatever the day decides to throw at me. I reach for my phone out of habit, squinting at the screen. It's a Google alert, my brother's name, a news headline. I sit up so fast the blanket slides off the bed entirely. I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand, stare at the ceiling, and take the longest breath of my life. I should probably feel something dramatic in that moment. Shock, maybe, or grief. But the truth is, somewhere underneath all of it, there's a quiet little voice that sounds a lot like the version of me from 4 years ago, the one who signed papers she never should have signed, who said yes when every instinct she had was screaming no, and that voice says, very calmly, I knew it would end like this. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a news alert. It starts with a phone call, a Sunday afternoon, and my mother's voice doing that particular thing it does when she wants something. I was 30 when my brother came to me with the plan. He'd been talking about buying a house for years, the kind of vague, aspirational talking that never seems to get any closer to actually happening. He was 34 at the time, working in logistics, decent salary but rough credit history from a period in his late 20s when he'd made some poor choices with credit cards and a personal loan he'd stopped paying. Nothing criminal. Just the ordinary financial wreckage that comes from being young and careless with money. I, on the other hand, had spent my entire adult life being the opposite of careless. I was the one in the family who'd read personal finance books at 22, who kept a spreadsheet for my monthly budget, who had a credit score I was quietly but genuinely proud of. I worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte. I understood numbers. I understood risk. And somehow, when it mattered most, I let all of that understanding get buried under the one thing that's always been my weakness. Wanting my family to think well of me. The plan my brother presented was simple, the way all plans that end badly are simple. He'd found a house in a suburb northeast of the city, 3 bedrooms, solid neighborhood, good school district for the kids he and his girlfriend were planning on having. The problem was his credit score. The bank wouldn't approve him a loan. If I co-signed the mortgage with him, the loan would go through without any trouble. He'd make every payment himself. I'd never have to think about it. In 2 years, once he'd built up his credit, he'd refinance and remove my name entirely. It's just on paper, he said. You won't even feel it. My mother was on the call too. She hadn't announced herself at the start, but I heard her breathing in the background and eventually she just started talking, the way she does. She said this was a real opportunity for my brother. She said he'd worked hard to get himself together. She said family takes care of family. She said I had a good job, a stable situation, that this would cost me nothing but my signature. I asked questions. I asked what happened to my credit if he missed a payment. He said he wouldn't miss a payment. I asked what the exit plan looked like if the refinance didn't work out in 2 years. He said it would definitely work out. I asked my mother what she thought would happen to our relationship if this went wrong. She paused and then said, "Why are you looking for reasons to say no?" I signed. I want to be honest here about why, because I've spent a lot of time with that question. It wasn't just family pressure, though that was real. It wasn't just that I wanted to be the good daughter, though that was real too. It was that my brother and I had genuinely been close when we were younger, before the money stuff started complicating everything. I remembered us as kids, building ridiculous forts in the living room, arguing over the remote, splitting a bag of chips in the back seat on long drives. I wanted to believe that person was still there. I wanted to believe that saying yes was an investment in our relationship, not just in a piece of real estate. I kept my copy of the documents in a folder in my home office. I tried not to think about it. For almost a year, everything seemed fine. My brother sent me texts sometimes when things with the house were going well. Look at the backyard now that he'd landscaped it. The new kitchen backsplash his girlfriend had picked out. The whole thing seemed to be working the way he'd promised. Then the texts got less frequent. Then they stopped. I didn't push. I was busy with work. I was in a new relationship of my own that was taking up most of my emotional bandwidth. I told myself the silence just meant things were normal. People get busy. Families settle into quiet rhythms. Not every relationship needs constant maintenance. I found out about the housewarming party from my cousin. She mentioned it in passing, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. She said something like, "That was such a fun time. "Your brother's place looks so good," and I smiled and said yes, absolutely, and then I went home and sat on my couch for a very long time. There had been a party, a full housewarming, with family, with food, with people I'd grown up with. My aunt had been there, my mother had been there, my brother's friends had been there. Apparently it had happened about 6 weeks earlier, on a Saturday afternoon in October when I had been, as far as I could recall, doing exactly nothing. I had not been invited. I called my mother that night. I kept my voice even. I asked her, as directly as I could manage, whether she had attended a housewarming party at my brother's house in October. She said yes. I asked why I hadn't been invited. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has a whole conversation inside it. She said my brother and his girlfriend had wanted to keep it small. She said they'd only had a limited number of people. She said she hadn't wanted to get in the middle of it. I asked when she had decided that being my mother meant not getting in the middle of it. She said I was being sensitive. I have heard that word my entire life. I have been called sensitive for crying at a funeral. I have been called sensitive for asking to be included in decisions that affected me. I have been called sensitive for having preferences. For a long time I believed it. I thought there was something genuinely wrong with my emotional calibration, some factory defect in the way I processed things. It took me until my late 20s to understand that in my family, sensitive is just the word they use when they want you to stop asking inconvenient questions. I asked my mother directly, "Does my brother understand that my name is on his mortgage? That my credit is tied to his financial behavior? That I co-signed a loan as a favor to this family, and I wasn't invited to the party to celebrate the house I helped him buy?" Another pause. Then, "He knows. He's grateful. Has he said that to me? I'm sure he means to." I hung up. I sat with the feeling for a few days because I've learned that I make worse decisions when I'm angry than when I've had time to let things settle. But once the initial heat of it faded, what I was left with wasn't sadness. It was clarity. A very specific, very cold kind of clarity about what I was to my family, and what I was not. I was the one you called when something needed to be fixed. When my mother's car broke down 2 years earlier, I had paid for the repair. When my aunt needed someone to review her lease before she signed it, she called me. When my brother needed a credit lifeline, he called me. I was useful in the way that a tool is useful. Indispensable right up until the moment the job is done, and then put back in the drawer. I decided I needed to understand the full picture of what I'd signed on to. I pulled out my copy of the mortgage documents for the first time in almost a year, and actually read them the way I should have read them before I signed. I'm a financial analyst. I know how to read documents. I have no good excuse for what I found. My name was listed not as a co-signer in the limited sense I'd understood, but as a co-borrower with equal liability. This distinction matters enormously. A co-signer is typically on the hook if the primary borrower defaults. A co-borrower is treated by the lender as equally responsible for the debt from the very beginning. It affects my debt-to-income ratio. It affects my ability to take out my own loans. I had not understood the scope of what I'd agreed to, partly because I hadn't read carefully enough, and partly because my brother had presented it in the vaguest possible terms. There was more. When I pulled my credit report, I found that there had been a 30-day late payment marked 6 months earlier. 1 month. It had dinged my score by 19 points. 19 points that I had not been told about, had not been warned about, had not been given the opportunity to address. I called my brother. He picked up on the third ring, which surprised me a little. I'd half expected it to go to voicemail. I told him I'd pulled my credit report. I told him I'd seen the late payment. I asked him what had happened. He said it was a bank error. He said he'd sorted it out. He said it was no big deal. I told him a 30-day late payment on a mortgage is not a bank error and is not no big deal. I asked him why he hadn't called me when it happened. He said he didn't want to worry me. I asked him if he understood that I was on this loan, that his financial behavior was my financial behavior, legally, that I was not a silent investor, that my name on those documents meant something real. He said, I said I handled it. And then, because I was already in it, and there was nothing left to lose, I asked him about the housewarming party. The silence that followed was different from my mother's silence. Hers had been careful, diplomatic, the silence of someone managing a situation. His was something else, shorter, almost impatient. He said his girlfriend had done the invitations. He said it had been mostly her friends and her family. He said he hadn't wanted to make it complicated. I asked him what was complicated about inviting his sister. He said, You know how you can be. I asked him what that meant. He said, you make everything a thing. I would like to pause here and acknowledge that this sentence, you make everything a thing, is one of the most effective ways to make a person feel insane that I have ever personally experienced. It's not an accusation you can really defend against. It reframes your legitimate concerns as personality flaws. It makes the person raising a reasonable objection feel like the problem. My brother has used some version of this phrase on me since we were teenagers, and every single time, it has worked. I've backed down. I've apologized. I've told myself maybe he was right. Maybe I was being too much. Not this time. I told him I wanted my name off the mortgage. I told him I wanted him to begin the refinancing process within the next 60 days. I told him I was documenting this conversation. He said, "You're serious right now." I said I was. He said that the market wasn't great for refinancing at the moment and that it wasn't the right time financially. He said we should revisit this in 6 months. He said I was being reactive. I told him 6 months was acceptable, but I needed it in writing. I told him I wanted us to put an agreement together, something with a real timeline and real terms. He said he'd think about it. He never called back. Over the next 3 months, I sent 4 emails. 2 to my brother, 1 to my mother asking her to encourage him to respond, and 1 to a real estate attorney I consulted about my options. The attorney was straightforward with me. Getting off a mortgage is genuinely difficult. The simplest path was the refinance my brother had always promised. The more complicated paths involved legal action that could damage both of us. She suggested I document everything, keep records of payments, and if a default looked imminent, contact the lender directly. My mother's response to my email was to call me and tell me I was destroying the family. I had been patient for the better part of 3 months at this point. I had been measured. I had been the kind of calm that requires enormous effort to maintain. When she said I was destroying the family, something in me just let go. I asked her when exactly I had become responsible for keeping this family together. I asked her whether she remembered, concretely, in dollars, how much money I had contributed to this family over the past decade. The car repair, the loan I'd given her during the period when her hours at work got cut and she needed help making rent, the money I'd handed my brother when he was between jobs 4 years earlier, which he had never paid back and which we had all silently agreed to forget. I was not angry about any of these things individually. I want to be clear about that. I helped because I wanted to, because they needed it and I was able. But I was being asked to continue absorbing consequences, continue providing stability, continue being the one who held things together, while also being left off the guest list and told I made everything complicated. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've changed." I said, "I hope so. I want to tell you about the morning I got that Google alert." It was a Tuesday. I had been at work late the night before, finishing up a quarterly report, and I'd gone to bed later than I should have. When the phone lit up before 7, I almost ignored it. I'm glad I didn't. My brother had been arrested. The article was from the local Charlotte News affiliate. It was brief, only a few paragraphs at that point, the kind of breaking story that goes up before anyone has all the details. But the details that were there were enough. My brother and 2 other individuals had been charged with mortgage fraud. The scheme, as described by federal investigators, involved falsifying income documentation on multiple loan applications. He had done this not once, not with our mortgage, but on at least 3 other properties that he and a business partner had purchased over the past 18 months, using inflated income figures and fabricated employment records to secure loans they had no legitimate basis to qualify for. I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time. The story spread fast. Local news picked it up first, then a couple of regional outlets. By mid-morning it was on social media. Someone had taken the mugshot from the county records and posted it. His name, his face, his arrest record, publicly searchable, permanently attached to his digital footprint in a way that doesn't really go away. My mother called me before 9. She was crying before she said a single word. I could hear it in her breathing, the sharp, effortful kind of crying that happens when someone is genuinely scared, not just upset. She told me she didn't know. She said she'd had no idea any of this was happening. She said she needed me to find an attorney. She said she needed me to call the bank. She said she needed me to come over. She said there was nobody else who knew how to handle something like this. I let her finish. And then I said something I had been building toward for 4 years. Something I had practiced in my head, in the shower and on drives, and in the quiet moments before sleep. never quite believing I would actually say it out loud. I said, "Mom, I love you, but I can't fix this." She said, "What do you mean you can't fix it?" I said, "I mean I'm not going to. Not this time." She asked me if I understood what this meant for my brother, for the family, for our name. I said yes. I understood exactly what it meant. I had, in fact, spent the previous several months understanding it in a level of detail she probably couldn't imagine. I understood what my co-borrower status meant in the context of a federal fraud investigation. I understood I would need my own attorney. I understood my credit situation was about to become significantly more complicated, and that this was a direct result of being pressured to sign documents I should never have signed. In service of a family that had not thought to invite me to a party in the house, those documents helped purchase. I told her I had already made an appointment with a real estate attorney. I told her I was managing my own legal exposure. I told her I was not able to simultaneously manage my brother's legal situation. She said, "He's your brother." I said, "I know." She said, "Family doesn't do this." I said, "Mom, family doesn't do a lot of things that have happened to me in the past few years. We could talk about that list, if you want, but I don't think today is the right day for it." She started to say something else. I told her I loved her, and that I'd call her in a few days, and I ended the call. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think people have this idea that moments of personal clarity feel triumphant, that when you finally hold a boundary, it feels like a movie scene, swelling music, confidence radiating off you. That's not what it was like. I put my phone down and I cried for a while. Not for my brother, exactly. Not for the situation he was in, which was very much of his own making. I cried for the version of this that didn't happen, the version where the family I grew up in was the family I needed it to be. I cried for the housewarming party, which sounds small when I say it out loud, but which had cracked something open in me that I was still dealing with. I cried because loving people who consistently treat you as optional is an exhausting way to live, and I was tired. And then I washed my face. I made coffee. I called my attorney. The legal situation took several months to fully sort out. Because I was a co-borrower, the federal investigation required me to cooperate with documentation requests. My attorney was excellent, and she made it clear early on that my exposure was limited, since I had no knowledge of or involvement in the fraudulent applications. The mortgage on my brother's property went into default once he was no longer able to manage payments. It was a mess, a genuine, protracted, exhausting mess that cost me money in legal fees and hours of my life I'll never get back. But I got through it. My name was eventually cleared from all of it, legally and on paper. My credit took a hit. It recovered. My mother and I had a real conversation about 3 months later. A long one, the kind that doesn't have a clean ending but that shifts something between two people. She didn't apologize for everything. I don't think she fully understood everything there was to apologize for. But she said that she had not considered what it cost me to be the reliable one, that she had taken it for granted, that she'd thought of my stability as something that just existed, like a natural resource, rather than something I had built deliberately and protected carefully. She said she was sorry for the party. She said it without me having to prompt her, which mattered. I told her I appreciated it. I meant it. My brother pled guilty to 2 of the fraud charges. He received a suspended sentence and a significant fine. The public record of his arrest, the one that got shared on social media, the mugshot, the news articles, those are still there. I don't take any pleasure in that. I want to say that clearly. Not because I'm trying to seem like a better person than I am, but because it's genuinely true. There's nothing satisfying to me about watching someone I used to build blanket forts with face federal charges. If anything, the satisfaction people might expect me to feel is replaced by something much flatter and sadder. What I do feel, when I'm honest about it, is relief. Relief that my name is no longer attached to his financial decisions. Relief that the phone calls asking me to handle things have slowed to almost nothing. Relief that I finally, at 31 years old, stopped performing the role of family safety net and started treating my own resources, financial and emotional, as things worth protecting. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who's in the place I was in 4 years ago. Someone who's the responsible one, the stable one, the one who gets called when things go wrong, and who gets quietly excluded from the celebrations. I don't have a tidy lesson to package up. I'm not sure real life works that way. But here's what I know. Being available to people who love you is a beautiful thing. Being available to people who treat your availability as a given, who call on you in crisis and forget you in joy, who describe you as complicated when you ask to be included, that's a different thing entirely. And it took me a very long time to understand that confusing the two wasn't love, it was habit. I went to see a house last spring. Not to co-sign anything, not to help anyone else, just for me, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I'd been watching for a couple of years, with a backyard that gets good afternoon light, and a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in. The mortgage is in my name only. The credit score I used to get approved for it is the one I rebuilt myself, after everything. I had a housewarming party. I invited the people who show up for me, not just the people who need me to show up for them. It was small. It was exactly right. My mother came. We're still figuring out what we are to each other now. Which version of mother and daughter survives once all the roles people play in a family get rearranged? It's slower and more uncertain than I'd like. But I'd rather have something real and slow than something fast and hollow. My cousin, who first told me about my brother's party, the one who'd assumed I already knew, she was there too. She's become one of my closest friends over this past year, which feels like the universe's clumsy way of compensating me for something. I didn't make a speech. I'm not really a speech person. But at one point in the evening, I was standing in my kitchen, the one with the good counter space, holding a glass of wine, and I looked around at the people in my living room, and I felt something I don't have a better word for than mine. This is mine. This life. This space. These people. This version of myself that knows what her signature is worth. I built this without anyone's help. And no one was going to take it from me. If there's anyone out there who's been the reliable one for so long you've forgotten that you're also allowed to be the celebrated one, I want you to hear this. You don't have to earn your place at the table. Especially not at a table you helped pay for. And if the people who should have saved you a seat didn't, maybe it's time to build your own. I'm not angry anymore. I've decided not to be, not because the things that happened weren't worth being angry about, but because I have better uses for that energy. I have a house. I have good afternoon light. I have a credit score I rebuilt with my own hands, and a stack of documents that have only my name on them. That's enough. More than enough. It's everything.